Welcome everyone for another updated 2016 NFL mock draft. This particular version is a one-round edition, and you could peep all 31 of the first-round picks in the description box down below. Now, the next one, which I'll probably do in another week and a half to 2 weeks, depending on my mood and how I'm feeling, whatever the case might be, is probably going to be a two-round edition, just so that way you can maybe start to get some insight on how I see things going a little bit deeper into the draft, what I think about other prospects outside of the guys in round number one, give you more names to pay attention to, more names to look at, what have you. Now, when I do some of these mock drafts, and again, I do this in part to inform and educate in terms of my philosophies, this particular one is just like many other ones, especially this early in the process. They're about different scenarios playing out. You don't want to read too much into everything. If I really believe in something, believe me, you will know it. For example, in 2014, in the lead up to that draft, everybody that watched this channel knows how big I was on Khalil Mack and how adamant I was that he should go over Jadeveon Clowney. Everybody also knows how big I was on Aaron Donald and also rating him as a better defensive prospect than Jadeveon Clowney, and who's laughing now. When there's that type of guy in a draft, like an Odell Beckham in 2014, I believe my exact quote was, if this guy works on his hands, he's going to be the best receiver in this class, and it's not even going to be close. Again, when I see those guys, I know it, and believe me, you'll know it too. But a lot of this early on, I'm still in the early stages of evaluating, scouting, watching. So as a result, I haven't formulated a lot of very strong opinions on prospects one way or another. I'm starting to look at trends and patterns. I go off of recent history. I go off of the history of the draft sometimes and how it works. The other thing I do is I don't necessarily subscribe to just what you see a lot of the better and well-known national draft media does. And I don't really subscribe to a lot of the things they say, especially this early in the process. And in particular, you will notice that in my mock drafts, compared to others that you may see. Now, the first thing I did with this mock draft scenario is I went into quarterback desperation mode, meaning that many teams are looking for quarterbacks, and therefore, as a result, that would lead to 4 of them being taken in round number 1. Do I think that's likely to happen? No. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible, especially in this particular draft class. I don't see it as a really strong draft. So if quarterbacks rate out similarly to other prospects and teams kind of have a need in different places, they'll go more off of need than they ever want to admit. At the end of the day, am I going to take a quarterback that I rate as an 80 out of 100, or am I going to take a defensive end that I rate as an 81 out of 100? I'm going to take the quarterback that rates an 80 out of 100 because I'm hoping his upside is more, and if he becomes a 90 and the defensive end becomes a 90, I'd rather have the quarterback that is a 90, if that makes sense. So you'll see here the Lions still with the number 1 overall pick based off of tiebreakers, meaning strength of schedule in this particular case. I've got them taking Jared Goff from California. That might surprise some of you with the fact that Matthew Stafford is in the fold with big money. But look, if Detroit ended up finishing the season with the number 1 overall pick, you would have to convince yourself, while they obviously would have needs all over the place, and in particular their big need is on the offensive line because they can't run the ball very well and they can't protect their quarterback. At the end of the day, how much longer are you going to tie yourself to the largely failed Matthew Stafford bandwagon? How much longer can you really afford to do that? And when you've got the chance to take a guy who could develop into the franchise quarterback that Matthew Stafford has never really truly fully developed into, the Detroit Lions would have to roll the dice, take that gamble. Goff wouldn't necessarily have to play right away, but it would maybe incentivize Matthew Stafford to play better immediately because he's playing for his long-term future somewhere else. You know, if the Lions end up with the number 1 overall pick, quarterback has to be a distinct possibility. And you'll see my Bears with the 6th overall pick going after a quarterback. I threw out Carson Wentz from North Dakota State. Big dude, 6'6", with an arm. He can really move. If you haven't checked him out much, go ahead and check him out. You might be surprised how good of a prospect he is. Then I've got the Houston Texans, a team just like the Bears that is desperate for quarterback help. I've got them taking Paxton Lynch, the big dude out of Memphis. Some of you saw what he did against Ole Miss. And you look at a guy like Paxton Lynch, a guy 6'6", 6'7", with arm strength. He has a rocket arm, a guy that can move. You know, he's the type of guy that, as the draft process goes along, can really shoot up boards, even though traditionally those taller, super tall quarterbacks don't always pan out very well in the NFL. Again, for a quarterback-desperate team like the Houston Texans, and frankly an organization that doesn't know what the fuck they're doing anyways, and I've talked about this before, a Paxton Lynch would be a possibility. Is it likely? No. But again, mind you, I am talking about scenarios. But could I see scenarios where some of the bigger name quarterbacks like Connor Cook, Christian Hackenberg, Cody Kessler, Gunnar Kiel, Cardale Jones don't really show themselves that well the rest of this college football season like they kind of already haven't? Could some of these other guys, these lesser-known prospects, along with maybe a guy like a Jacoby Brissett, move up draft boards? Absolutely. I wouldn't rule that out at all. And then you'll look at the 18th pick. A lot of you may be surprised that I have the Dallas Cowboys taking Connor Cook. At that particular stage, that's about the right spot, in my opinion, for a Connor Cook to go. You're looking at a Cowboys team that has largely neglected the backup quarterback position. Romo's not going to be the guy forever. And when you bring in Connor Cook, you can bring him in, you can give him time, you can learn the system, you can work on some of the fundamentals and accuracy issues that you need to. He doesn't have the pressure to play right away. He can learn behind one of the better quarterbacks in the game in Tony Romo, but you've also provided yourself some quality insurance in case Tony Romo does go down with an injury again. You can't continue to have Tony Romo run the risk of getting hurt, being gone for extended periods of time, and then you don't have anybody in the wheelhouse. You don't have anybody in the bullpen. You go to Brandon Whedon and Matt Castle. You're not doing anything. You're not going anywhere doing that. So at that point in time, looking at need combined with value based off the way draft plays out, I would highly advocate the Dallas Cowboys taking Connor Cook, and there could be a possibility that Cook would end up dropping. One thing to keep in mind is that the NFL draft media tends to hitch its wagon to the wrong quarterbacks, and by and large, you've seen in recent years outside of this past year where Winston Mariota went 1-2, most of these other years, these quarterbacks really drop. They really drop compared to where people think they should go. And that's because of our fascination and obsession with the quarterback position. Speaking with a couple of guys that kind of fit into the mold of this year's overrated NFL draft media prospects, I go to two guys, and I go to Joey Bosa, the defensive end from Ohio State, and Robert Nkemdiche, the defensive lineman from Ole Miss. Now, when I look at these guys, these are two explosive edge rushers, two guys that are big-time names that have the potential to be big-time games and big-time players at the next level. However, when I look at Joey Bosa, I see a guy that reminds me maybe of a more athletic Bjorn Werner, and it's not just a race comparison, okay? What I'm talking about is a guy that about 6'5" or so, 275 pounds. I don't know if he's quick enough in the hips and athletic enough to play full-time outside linebacker in a 3-4. And I don't know that he can get big enough and still keep his athleticism and his effectiveness enough to play at 295 or 300 to be able to play a defensive end in a 3-4. Which means that Bosa is somewhat scheme limited, in my opinion, at least at this moment, based off of what I've observed so far, as a 4-3 defensive end. And when you look, especially in this particular draft scenario that I have playing out, all the teams that played the 3-4, once you get past Detroit and Jacksonville at 1 and 2, Baltimore, Kansas City, Tennessee, Chicago, Cleveland, Houston, Washington, San Francisco, San Diego, New Orleans, they all play the 3-4. And Bosa may not be a fit for any of those teams in any of those schemes. Now, chances are, would one of those teams potentially gamble on the overall talent and upside and try to make it fit, make it work? Yes. But I don't think any of you should be surprised when all is said and done, if you have a lot of 3-4 teams picking in the top 5 or top 10 in this upcoming draft, which is more than likely what's going to happen, that a guy like Bosa is going to fall because some teams are going to be really concerned about his long-term schematic fit. And also, with all the hype that he has, some teams are potentially going to be scared off because there's going to be some Jadeveon Clowney comparisons. And some of those comparisons, I think, are legitimate in terms of straight-up player comparisons. But you have concerns about the fact that I know I did in 2013. Clowney had 3.5 sacks in his last year in college. Supposed to be so dominant, yet he wasn't getting home consistently. And a lot of times he wasn't being doubled or triple teamed, no matter how much the pro-Clowney draft media tried to spin it. Bosa, same type of deal. Hasn't been nearly as productive as people might expect, and you would have some concerns about that. If he's supposed to be a big-time player, he should make big-time plays on a big-time consistent basis. And when you look at Nkemdiche, here's a guy that I think is somewhat playing out of position at Ole Miss. I look at him as a really good 3-4 defensive end, a guy scheme who he would be perfect for is somebody like Wade Phillips. I really believe that. I look at Nkemdiche. Some teams are going to look at him as a 4-3 cover 2 type of tackle, that traditional 3 technique penetrating tackle. Some teams will look at him as a 3-4 defensive end, which is what I think might be his best role. I think he could be a big-time stud. However, I know there are beginning to be some rumblings about some concerns about him off the field in terms of what his priorities and what his focuses are. I also know that I want to watch this guy on film. He takes a lot of plays off. There are times where he's right in the quarterback's face. He's busting up a running play. But there's other times that as soon as the play is away from him at all, he's jogging, he's loafing it. And I think some other teams are going to be concerned about this going forward. And also, again, when we talk about schematic fit, maybe not everybody buys that his best position is as a 3-4 defensive end. And if teams pigeonhole him into being a 4-3 defensive lineman, in particular a 3-technique 4-3 defensive lineman, as a result, he's another guy that could potentially slip along with other concerns. So you'll see in my mock draft here, I've got Nkemdiche going 12 to the Saints, and I've got Bosa going 14 to the Buccaneers. Am I guaranteeing that both of these guys are going to drop out of the top 10 entirely? No. Am I even cocksure that one of them is going to drop out of the top 10? No. Do I think it's realistic? Do I think it's a possibility? Absolutely. Absolutely. But overall, when I'm watching this draft, and again, you can look at my 31 picks in the description box below, and you can chime in with your thoughts, your comments. If you have questions for me about any of the picks or any other prospects, you can feel free to chime in with those as well. So far, when I'm watching this draft class, I'm not that thoroughly impressed, if I can say so. I'm just not. I don't see that clear-cut #1 prospect, at least at this moment, although there are a couple guys I'm looking at that I might give that label. I haven't found that guy yet, or those guys that I've developed that Schleg Daddy draft crush for, like I did with Donald and Beckham and Mack in 2014, for example. Just haven't seen those guys yet. I'm sure a couple of them will develop, but, you know, I look at this class, I don't think the wide receiver class is great. It's okay, but I don't think it's great or anything special. I don't think the offensive line class, once you get past the top 2, is all that particularly great, although some might throw Alexander in there as a guard, as being another elite type of prospect. But again, we're talking about an offensive guard. I think this is a pretty good class for defensive linemen. Linebacking position, not a lot of great edge rushers based off of what I see at this point in time. Kind of a weak class for corners, a good class for safety. So if you're a team in need of safety help, like I only have 2 safeties going in round 1 here. I expect a few more to actually go in round 1 when all's said and done, probably 4 of them, because the safety class I think is much better than the corner class. Quarterbacks are going to be what ultimately makes this draft, as is so often the case. If somebody like Goff can show that he's worth the #1 overall pick, and a couple of these other guys can validate being guys considered in first round or even early first round consideration, it helps the overall strength of this draft class because it needs it. Because right now when I'm looking at it, this isn't a particularly strong class.